Today we are at Knoxville Public Library in the Glover Room on the second floor of the library, and we have a display here today about Dr. Lewis, and we also have Eugene Seelye on hand with us here, and he has some memories of Dr. Lewis and Mrs. Lewis and where they lived, and some of his memories as a younger fellow growing up in Knoxville and interactions with the Lewises. How did you first meet the Lewises?
Well, Dr. and Mrs. Lewis lived 2 houses from my family on South Water Street, and they were our family doctor. So I've known him for as long as I can remember. He had an office in his house, and it's a house that many people will remember, Marge Schoonover on South Water Street. That was the Dr. Lewis house, and this sign that you see here was out front of the house.
So, Jean, I've heard you talk some before about the social card playing clubs, game clubs, and cards being played among the people as a social activity here in town. Can you tell us some of your memories about that?
Well, both my father and mother liked to play cards, pinochle, bridge, and I can remember as a little child, my father and mother would go in the evening to the home of Henry and Maud Bolio, and Henry Bolio was a station agent at the New York Central station, and they lived just this side of the railroad station house on South Water Street. And they would take me along with them while they would sit down and play cards, and I would crawl up on like a day bed in the room where they were playing cards and go to sleep. And when they had finished playing cards, I can remember my dad would pick me up, put me over his shoulder, and take me home and put me to bed. But playing cards was fairly common. My dad belonged to a pinochle club, and they met in different houses. They took turns in meeting in houses. I don't think there was ever refreshments. It wasn't that kind of a card club. They didn't meet to eat. The women had a women's bridge club that met during the day, and I'm trying to think if they ever had refreshments. I don't think that they particularly had refreshments either. It was basically you went and you played cards, and I think usually there were 2 tables of bridge for the women. And I can remember once my father and mother had a new living room rug, and one of the ladies had, I think it was a cranberry drink of some kind that she was drinking, and she spilled some of it on the floor, and I can remember that it stained the carpet with this red, I think it was cranberry juice. It wasn't wine, that I'm sure. Mm-hmm. But anyway, then there was a couples club. So husband and wife played cards, and I think that was also a bridge club. And that met in various houses. But I don't think the main purpose of any of them was to get together to eat or to have refreshments. I think it was mainly to play cards. And the couples club usually met at night because most of the men worked.
Mm-hmm. So when your father carried you home and you were sleeping, he wasn't putting you in the car and driving you across town. He was walking you up the street,
across
right?
the street, because it was not that far from our house, just across the street and down toward the railroad tracks.
Okay. And
our house was located at what I would say is at the end of Alba Street. So when you go up Alba Street from the east, going west, our house was right at the end of Alba Street.
And I'm thinking of that house as a petite, narrow house.
Yes.
Narrow compared to the ones on either side.
Yes.
So was there any money involved in their games?
No.
No. Okay. No money, no food.
They didn't play for matches or pennies or anything. Later on, I can remember there was a women's card club that Jane Glover belonged to, and I think they had either nickels or quarters or something that they, because Jane would often tell me, oh, she would say, I won 25 cents today playing cards, or I lost 10 cents or something like that, but it was a minimal amount of money that changed hands.
Okay. We're here in the history room at the library, and we have pulled out some vintage scrapbooks from events over the years at the A.W. Lugg department store in Knoxville. And we have Jean on hand to tell us some of the memories of stories that you recall about the Lugg store and the Luggs as they were when you were a youngster.
When I was growing up, I think might have been junior high or senior high school. My mother used to work at Lugg's department store during Christmas time, or when they needed some extra help. She would oftentimes go in and help out in the dry goods area on the first floor. And eventually, I guess I don't remember how it happened, but they hired me to come after school. And my job was, after school, was to, first of all, empty the waste baskets. And they had a burn barrel in the back of the house, or back of the store, I'm sorry. And so I would burn papers and burn material that needed to be gotten rid of, which of course is a no-no today. And then after I did that, I would very often work in the grocery part. So the first floor was dry goods, and grocery was in a separate room. And the basement area had shoes. The second floor was women's wear and housewares on the second floor. Things like wallpaper and dishes and so forth. Juanita Lugg and Hugh Lugg were the owners of the store. And their two sons, Robert and Don, were workers there, and Don had charge of dry goods on his side of the store, and Bob Lugg had charge of the grocery store on his side of the store. So then I would sweep floors that needed to be swept. I would also stock shelves in the grocery store, and once in a while help carry groceries out for people or pack groceries. I don't think I usually did anything at the cash register. It was mostly helping somebody. I would also work with the produce, trimming lettuce and whatever needed to be done to make the produce look attractive. But then I began doing window displays in the front in the grocery store, stacking things in the windows, and then eventually Don Lugg in the dry goods would have me come over, and I would do window displays, helping him with window displays in the windows on the dry goods side. I had a great aunt who lived in just the edge of Knoxville into Deerfield Township, and she lived in a house that she and her husband built. It's a Sears and Roebuck house, and it looks exactly today as it did when it was built. But she was a widow when I knew her, and she was not too well physically, but my dad was looking after her. She would be his aunt and my great aunt, but she would call in orders of groceries for groceries at the store. And every order that she called in always included sharp cheese and chocolate-covered cherries. Those are two things that she lived on. And since I was not old enough to drive, I had a bicycle. And so I would pedal down through Main Street on my bicycle and deliver the groceries to her. And there were a couple of other people that would oftentimes call in and ask for groceries to be delivered. I've been trying to think. I think they sometimes charged maybe a quarter or so for delivery of the groceries to their house. But Hugh and Juanita Lugg were very nice people, and they also partially owned a store in Tyrone, Pennsylvania. and the store was called Lug and Edmonds. And periodically on a Sunday, they would drive down to the store in Tyrone when the stores were both closed. And several times they would ask me to ride with them to Tyrone on a Sunday morning, and we would go out and eat at a very nice place in Tyrone, and then they would go to the store and do whatever they needed to do. I have no idea what they were doing, but checking the books or something. And I had free reign of the store, so I enjoyed walking around, and they had furniture and clothing and no groceries. It was all dry goods. But I enjoyed walking around and looking at all the things in their store in Tyrone. And then we would return in the afternoon or early evening because I would have school the next day and they would go to work.
So the store in Tyrone was smaller?
The store in Tyrone was larger. And I think I'm trying to think whether it was sold first, or I just don't remember how it disappeared.
Okay.
Whether the Lug sold it or Lug and Edmonds sold it, but I think it was closed before the Lug store in Knoxville was closed. That's my recollection. I may be wrong on that.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So in the last couple of years, we've all become very familiar with phone-in or online shopping and having it delivered. And so does it seem in some ways that has come full circle in terms of thinking of yourself as a bicycle delivery person?
I was the Uber person.
You were the DoorDash boy,
yes,
or something like that. Okay, Uber Eats or
right.
Mm-hmm, okay.
Yes.
What were there other customers that you knew of, or was it mostly your relative that you would deliver groceries
no,
to?
It was other.
There were
other
others.
Customers. The only one, the relative that I remember was the great aunt.
Okay.
And they had a big business in New York State. A lot of people in New York State came to trade in Knoxville.
Mm-hmm.
That was before there was any grocery store, I think, in Austinburg.
So people from Steuben County, Troopsburg, Jasper, Woodhull would sometimes come down?
Yes,
mm-hmm.
Yes.
Okay.
Some of their best customers were from that area.
Okay. So on your bicycle, I'm curious, did you have a basket or a little trailer, or how did you?
No, I had a basket, and my bicycle was a Schwinn. If you're familiar with bicycles, it was a Schwinn. And I have no idea where I got it, but I think I picked it out and picked out the one I wanted. And if I remember, it was not the cheapest one. It was fairly expensive, and it was sort of a dark red maroon color. But it had a basket in the front, so that's how I would have to carry the groceries. It was in a basket that was on the front of the bicycle. So
you became very good at balancing if you had very many things in that front basket.
Well, apparently, yes.
Okay.
I wouldn't say that there were a lot of deliveries that I had to make or that I did make. Mm-hmm. But I do remember the one going to my great aunt's with the chocolate covered cherries and the cheese.
Okay, yeah. So those were staples in her pantry.
Yeah, apparently,
everybody's
they might have been the death of her eventually.
Everybody's version of a staple grocery is different, right?
Yep.
Interesting. Okay.
And my great aunt's husband died before I was born, and his name was Eugene, and that's where I got my name, was from my great uncle's first name. And my great aunt was a sister of my grandfather's wife.
Okay. Well, we know that you have many relatives.
Oh, yes.
All around. And so, but his name was not Eugene Seelye. His name was Eugene something else. His name, the Eugene that you were named after, his last name.
As far as I know, it was just Eugene. I don't know of any middle name. But
his last name would have been
Winchester.
Eugene Winchester.
Eugene Winchester.
Okay.
Yes.
So.
And he and his wife are buried over in Riverside Cemetery here in Knoxville.
Okay.
No children.
Well, that's a good memory of the time at Lugs. Did you ever have to dress a mannequin in the window display?
Well,
they can be tricky.
I have dressed mannequins before, but I'm not sure. When I was growing up, there were 3 churches in town that I remember: the Baptist Church, the Methodist Church, and what we call the Holy Rollers, which I guess today would be like an Assembly of God, or I'm sure there are other names for it. And sometimes as kids we liked to go down when the Holy Rollers had their service and listen to the carryings on. But anyway, my father and mother went to the Baptist Church, so that's where we joined. And for a while, I think maybe I might have been in high school still, or in college at that time. But anyway, at one time I was superintendent at the Sunday school at the Baptist Church. And I can remember one morning, one of the Sunday school teachers came to me laughing, and she said, "Guess what?" And I said, "What?" She said, "Well," she said, "I was talking about Jesus Christ this morning in Sunday school class, and one little girl piped up and said, 'Oh, my daddy talks about him all the time.'" Well, I knew who it was. She told me who it was, and she was right. Her daddy did talk about him all the time, and many other things too that are well, we had a good laugh over that.
Out of the mouths of babes, right?
And their father was known for being rather salty in his language. But that's another story with the Dearmans. Albert Dearman used to be referred to in Knoxville as a 10-cent millionaire. He never worked a day in his life. He managed to live on his inheritance from his parents. And eventually, Kate, the wife, did go back to college and get a teaching degree, and she did teach. But whatever Albert decided to do, he always did the best. He used to take pictures, and he would take prize-winning photographs. He used to raise roses, and he would have prize-winning roses in the garden. He used to raise dogs, I think setters of some kind, and they were the best that there was. And I remember, drove to Binghamton to buy a sound system for the house, record players and radios and all that. He wanted the best that there was, and so he did that. And on the dogs, one of his dogs that he liked had throat cancer and had to be put down. And I remember he was telling people, he said, "Hell," he said, "that dog never smoked a cigarette in its life, and it died of lung cancer."
Did Mrs. Dearman play tennis, lawn tennis? Mrs. Dearman, Mrs. Catherine?
That was Emerette Dearman's over here.
Oh.
Yes.
So, can you tell us about the lawn tennis?
Well, Emerette Dearman and her husband had a tennis court in back of their house, and that would be right beside the current library. And my mother used to play tennis there, and I often wished that I knew how to play tennis. It's too bad when I was growing up there was nothing like tennis in phys ed classes at school, but she had an outfit that she would wear for playing tennis, and she liked to ride horses, and she had a complete outfit to wear when she was riding horses.
So this was Mrs. Emerette.
This was my mother that had the outfits for them, but it was behind Emerette's house was where the tennis court was located.
Oh, okay. So did Emerette keep her horse right here in town?
No, she didn't have horses. No,
Oh, your mother had the horse.
My mother would ride horses. She never owned horses, but she had friends in Conesque that had horses, and so she would go to Conesque and ride horses with one of her friends up there. But I remember I had all of her outfits, her riding clothes, for a long time before I got rid of them.
Interesting. So I guess it is interesting to think that there was someone who had a tennis court in their back lawn at that time.
And I have no idea
Knoxville.
who played. I don't know whether any of the Dearmans, must be Emmerich or her husband or sons, might have played tennis. But
okay. And Emmerich, her husband would have been an uncle to Albert? Now we're going off into Dearman relationships, but
there were
two
Dearman store
brothers. Way back there was Justus Dearman and
right.
Albert Dearman.
And then Albert Dearman had a son, I think, Albert Dearman. And Emmerich Dearman's husband was Quentin Dearman.
Okay.
And he was a son of, I'm getting mixed up now.
One of the other Dearman business
yes.
partners.
So I think they would have been cousins.
So the first merchants that were the Dearman brothers that had a store and a co-op.
Yep.
So my understanding is they dealt both in cash and in kind. So they would take. They were known as a cash store, but they also, during the times of the barter economy, would take other items of value and trade. So it's somewhat of a co-op, somewhat of a merchant store, but they were the first two to accumulate this wealth. Would that be what you would say?
Yes, I guess so, yes.
During the very early times, and then...
But trading in things like people who had chickens would take their eggs to the store and trade them for other groceries. That was fairly common.
Right.
At that time.
Right, and I have seen the advertisements where the Dearmans would put in that they would take, some of it was seasonal, but not always. They would take these things like honey or eggs or a commodity they knew they could sell.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. So, Jean, a question about how things used to be in terms of economy in Knoxville. We know that there was a very prosperous period of time, and there were families that were in business and merchants. And can you comment on your understanding of some of those families and how they might have owned a farm elsewhere, and how some of that economy was working in terms of when the banks were not as large or not insured, and there was more maybe private financing going on. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Mrs. Ashton, for instance, that you had mentioned.
Well, Mrs. Ashton was a lawyer's wife here in Knoxville, and I just vaguely can remember of her husband dying. But I do know that she loaned money to many people in the area, probably because they either didn't trust the banks or didn't want anybody knowing their business, a bank maybe, I'm just not sure why. But anyway, I also have many diaries from my grandparents who had a farm up the gravel Deer Lake Road in Deerfield Township, and going through her diaries, I found where people would come wanting to borrow money from my grandparents, which I had never been aware of before. And my grandmother would comment about somebody coming and making a payment, or somebody coming and wanting to borrow money, and she would say, no way, we're not loaning them any money. But this money loaning business was fairly prominent, I think, in maybe the late 30s, 40s, in that time period. Mm-hmm. And I think it was fairly lucrative, especially for Mrs. Ashton, because when she died, I think her estate was over $1 million. And she had a friend, the two of them, Cora Tucker. Cora Tucker was a friend of Ethel Ashton's. And supposedly the scuttlebutt was that Cora Tucker, whose husband was a banker, that when he died, that she didn't have much of any income at all. and they got acquainted with Ethel Ashton and Cora Tucker somehow got acquainted with a broker from the Philadelphia area who did business with people in Wellsboro. His name was Dick Lowe, and Dick Lowe supposedly built up Mrs. Tucker's account, so when she died, she had something like over $70,000 or $80,000, and he worked with Ethel Ashton as well, and in fact, he was her executor when she died. But I think having farms and farmers that needed money was a source of income for some of these people. And I'm assuming that they either didn't trust banks, or maybe it was because of, I don't know, but
Probably complex, having to do with everything from in 1883. I know, for instance, it well documented the big bank failure in Tioga that
yes.
ruined Tioga, and everyone knew it, and so that it might have probably didn't start with that, but that didn't help, and then
Right.
all the way during that era, and then of course the crash of 29, where there is no FDIC.
Yep.
So it took some time for the federal government to insure the banks, and it was kind of a sketchy during those decades. Maybe, I don't know. Well, thank you.
I'm Eugene Seelye. I live currently in Wellsboro, but I used to live in Knoxville and was at the library a lot. But Sherry, the librarian, has asked me if I would say something about the Brewster family who used to live in this house. Abby Brewster was a McNeil Billings Brewster, and she was born in 1864 and died in 1956. Her husband was Horace Isaac Brewster, and he was born in 1853 and died in 1918. They had two sons, Robert, who was born in 1893 and died in 1894, and Junior, who was born in 1895 and died in 1913, and they're all buried in the Knoxville Cemetery. I was 22 years old when Mrs. Brewster died, and the stories that I remember came from my father, Clifton Seelye, from Ed Glover, from Bob Edgecombe, and Brian Edgecombe. And so I just remember a few things, since at that time I was teaching school. But I can remember a couple things about Mrs. Brewster. One of the things that I remember was whenever she left the house, she always had a hat and gloves, something that people do not do anymore. There are a couple things that are interesting that I've heard. They said that when Mrs. Brewster had a man in the house would come for some reason, not her, other than her husband, that as soon as they left the house, she would fumigate the house after they were here. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. In the library here, there is a chandelier that hangs in the stairwell, and it's been electrified. But originally, there were 3 of those chandeliers in the living room of the library, and they were down so low that you pretty much had to walk around them. So they had, when the library took over, they had those removed, and one was electrified, and as I said, it's in the stairwell now. I can't remember whatever happened to the other 2. It maybe was that they sold them. I don't think they stored them on the 3rd floor. You don't remember any being stored, okay?
Yeah, they're definitely not there.
The story is that when Mr. Brewster was building the house, this house, apparently some of his workmen weren't too happy with him, and so on his noon hour, some of the workmen took some of his tools and nailed them to the side of the house. I can't substantiate that, but that's a story I've always heard. When my dad, Clifton Seelye, was alive, he was about the same age as the Brewster boys, and one day when they were playing up on what is now the third floor or the ballroom, one of the boys broke a dish that his mother had given them, and he didn't want his mother to find out, so he opened the back window, which would be the back window of the ballroom, and threw it out in the backyard so that his mother wouldn't find the dish. Again, I think my father is the one that told me that story. One day when Mr. Glover, who lived next door, Ed Glover, he hadn't seen Mrs. Brewster for a while, and so he came over and he knocked on the door and couldn't raise her and wondered what had happened to her. So he came around to the side where the tower is outside, got a ladder, and went up to the window in the tower. That would be where Mrs. Brewster's bedroom was, in the front of the house, and opened the window and crawled in and found her dead in bed. That story, I've heard several people say that was true. Abby's bedroom upstairs had 2 doors, and they were double doors at one time. In other words, there were 2 swinging doors on each of the 2 doors, each of the 2 openings. And now, of course, there's just 1 door. The other has been removed. When Abby died, her grandson, Ernest Brewster, lived in Rochester, New York. He had charge of settling up her estate. There was an auction with the contents in the backyard of the house. I can remember coming to that, and I think I bought a couple of dishes that I have at home. Sag Hazel, I believe, was the auctioneer at the time. But most everything was sold, and the grandson decided he wanted to take the 2 gas lights on the newel posts for the stairs as you go upstairs. So he removed the 2 gas fixtures, gas lights, took them to Rochester, and sometime later he came back and he said, I think these belong here. So the library was glad to get them back, and they electrified them when they got them back. Originally there was a 2-story addition on the back of the house, and the upstairs was like a sleeping porch in the summertime. And of course that has been dismantled and disappeared. At one time there was more of a porch in the front. It didn't go all the way across the front. It went from where the porch is now to the tower on the first floor. I think 1 or 2 of the boys attended Cazenovia College, and Cazenovia College is near Syracuse, New York, and I just learned not too long ago that college is disbanding. No more students are being taken in the fall of 2023. Okay, can you think of anything else you want to add? I think that's basically all that I can remember.
Do you recall anything being said about the events, the social events that they had upstairs?
I don't remember any of those, but there are quite a few clippings here in the files that talk about her entertaining people for dinner in the dining room. And the dining room is where part of the front of the house is. And then afterwards, they would have dancing in the ballroom. Also, the Brewster family had a camp or a cottage at Gaines, Pennsylvania, right along Route 6. And when you leave Gaines going toward Gailton on the left-hand side, the land drops down precipitously to Pine Creek, and sort of clinging next to the hill was a cottage that was the Brewster cottage. And when the road was improved, I think the cottage disappeared, and there's nothing left that would give you any clue that there ever was a cottage there.
Nothing more standing.
Yeah. Right. and they said that she had a bathroom in the cottage with a window so she could sit on the toilet seat and look out the window and see Pine Creek. Good for her.
Yeah. What about this bank that used to be on the front of the property? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
To the left of the library, as you face it, there was a bank building. And the bank building was owned by Mrs. Emmerich Dearman, and Mrs. Dearman lived in the house next door. Who is it that lives there now? Sandy
Fisher.
Right.
Yes.
She lives in the Emmerich Dearman house. And when Emmerich's son inherited the property, I think he lived in the Syracuse area. I think he gave the building and the property to the library, for which I can remember, and they tore it down. And at one time, Everett Dearman's husband had an office in there, so Everett always kept it. I never remember Mr. Dearman that lived in the house, but it was always kept as an office, fully furnished. But then eventually things were taken out of it, and the library took possession of the building and had it torn down.
There was an incident with a stairwell as well?
I think it was Mary Wood Wetmore that was going up the stairs sometime, and the stairs weren't very solid, and she kind of went through the floor. I think that's what I've heard.
Yeah.
There was a story about, I think it was Mary Wetmore.
I think there was a whole bunch of people that were caught upstairs because the stair.
That could
Yeah.
be. That I don't
Oh my
remember.
goodness.
I do remember that the stairs did give way, part of them anyway.
Between the Glovers and this house that you talked about him finding her, but what was there? Were they good friends relationship, or they were just neighbors?
I think so. Yeah, I think the Glovers and Abby were good friends, as far as I know.
Looked out for each other.
Kind of, yes.
Yeah.
I'm sure Ed and Jane both checked on Abby to see if she was around and about, because I'm trying to think how old she was. I'd have to subtract. If she died in, let's see, she died in 1956.
About 8 years. So she must have been about 91, 92.
She must have been, in her 90s. That sounds about right. You know. And I can remember when the library bought the building, the kitchen was very, very dated. And the bathroom, there was a bathroom on the second floor, which was very tiny and very dated as well. And that bathroom on the second floor had the fixtures removed and was used for storage, but it was not very big. It was tiny.
Was that the only bathroom that was in the building?
Only bathroom.
Oh my goodness.
Yes.
And that is tiny.
Well, now wait a minute. I think later on she had a bathroom installed downstairs, which is part of where you keep the cleaning materials.
Okay.
Down
those little
down the
stairs.
steps and sort of,
Okay. It must have gotten hard for her to climb the stairs as she got older.
Yes, could be. Yeah. When the addition was added to the house, we were very pleased to think that the builder, the architect, or not the architect, but the architect and the builder, Fulmer. What was his first name?
Larry
Marvin Fulmer. And when he added the new addition onto the back of the building, extended the back from what was the dining room, he was very careful to make sure that all the new woodwork in the house matched the old woodwork in the front of the house, which I'm sure was a lot more expensive to do it. But every window casing and door casing that you look at is exactly the same kind that was in the front of the house to match the original woodwork.
They all belong.
Yes, and I'm sure through the years it will darken to be more like the woodwork in the front of the house.
I want to see what you're talking
I
about.
think upstairs in the Holbert room there are two concrete tops of columns that came from the front porch. The front porch was wooden, but I think at the top of the columns on the front porch they are Greek capitals in concrete, which were on that porch. You maybe didn't even remember those. I think there's at least one. I don't know if there's any more than one or not.